All right, here we go in 3, 2, 1. What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Sports Medicine Broadcast, Cramping Science. This is round 2. We're talking with Dr. Sandra Fowkes-Godek, a world-renowned researcher, scientist, expert in most anything heat, illness related, or thermoregulation. She's a full professor at the Department of Sports Medicine at Westchester University, given more than 80 regional, national, and international presentations, put on conferences, just a monster of knowledge in anything heat or exertional heat stroke related. And so we're super excited to have you on here. Just talking to us about cramps and maybe some of the myth busting and some of the science. And it was actually really funny. Just yesterday on Facebook in the secondary schools group, there was a post about what do y'all do for cramps? And I'm like, oh my gosh, last week I did a podcast with it. This week I did a podcast. This week I'm doing another podcast. Next week I think I'm doing another one just about cramping science, because I don't know the facts. And, I just go with, oh, well, here's a cool new product. Oh, somebody said try this. So I'm super excited to have you. And then, of course, Mike McKenney bringing all the scientific questions and knowledge, whereas I just have all this basic, simple ones. So Dr. Sandy Fowkes-Godek, thanks for coming on the podcast and joining us.
Oh, thanks for asking me. Thank you. Thanks to you and Mike both.
This one is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/cramping science folks, which is FOWKES. Again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/cramping science folks. That's all one word. So without much further ado, Mike is going to take it away.
Hey guys. So I think in a little bit of a follow-up to what we did last week, I know for those that listened along or have watched it with Dr. Miller last week, I think some of the myth busting that we talk about is, I don't like to look at it more as myth busting, as more as just an evaluation of available scientific evidence and seeing how it applies to our daily practice. So, but I wanted to start with just to give everyone kind of an idea of what Sandy's role is, because I think it's extremely unique in the athletic training field and research field. So could you just tell us a little bit about your work at Westchester and how it led you to working with the Philadelphia Eagles and this idea of fluid balance, cramping? I know there's some thermoregulation research in there as well.
Right. So when I took the position at Westchester back in 1990, I've been there now almost 30 years. So 1991, I guess. It was a clinical position. It was teaching and clinical really only. We're in a unique situation, and we still are in this situation at Westchester, where all of our faculty members actually practice. So everybody has at least one team, if not two, are doing hours in the athletic training room. I'm still the one that runs our orthopedic and general medical clinic. So I basically see all of the athletes that the physicians need to see. So I still have that clinical role. But way back when, I had to get my PhD. So I did that. Actually, commuting back and forth to Temple, it took me some time to do that, but I was still clinically involved. So my research had just kind of spun out of being an assistant with football at the time, and looking at the IV versus oral. I got into this area of fluid balance by looking at the difference between oral hydration and IV hydration. Really trying to, it's ironic, it's such a paradox, but really trying to dispel the myth that IV hydration worked. So I did that. It was my doctoral dissertation was on that. I actually used the Temple football players as subjects. So the one thing that I've been really fortunate to do is work in an environment research related where I've been able to use the actual players. And I think that's very unique in and of itself. I've studied over the years. So I started with the Temple football players. That spun right into the Westchester football players. So right after I finished my doctoral dissertation, and I found with the IV versus oral hydration was right when Corey Stringer passed away. And following that, I got a pretty large grant from the NFL, and then my research, really started at Westchester, looking at the football players. And back then, the 2000 fluid replacement paper came out, and I had a lot of my colleagues, some of them who were athletic trainers in the NFL, were asking me about whether or not I thought that worked, because my dissertation was in that area. So anyway, my research kind of took off from there with the Westchester football players. I did a series of things back in 2002, 2003, and we basically studied them almost every year. But that led me to a role with doing research with Philadelphia Eagles. Rick Burkholder was the head athletic trainer at the time. The two assistants were Eric Sugarman, who now is the head at Minnesota, and Chris Peduzzi, and some other people that were, those guys were, well, Chris and Eric were students of mine. So they brought me up to camp. So that kind of led to this, 15-year run with doing first research and now more of a consulting role with the Philadelphia Eagles.
Mm-hmm. And I always want to point that out because I think, right, whether it's right or wrong, I think sometimes scientists get a real bad rap and not having their hands in a clinical setting. Like, oh, I looked at this in a very internally valid setting. How does this apply to an externally valid? And I think Jeremy and I have this talk. High school soccer on Friday nights does not matter. You want a clinical clamping case? Apparently Jeremy's got them every Friday. So, so how do we work with that? But you brought up a point with your dissertation that I think is actually just a good place to start of looking at. It's I think a discussion that's been around a while and it's coming back. I've actually heard and this is just from me lurking around the secondary school ATs group, this idea that IVs are starting to creep into the secondary setting. So, really? So I guess if there's anywhere to start, I think that's talking about fluid balance, plasma volume, and electrolytes because of saline. So,
right.
What are your thoughts on, since we're talking about muscle cramping, where IVs might fit and where they don't fit?
Right. So, my thought now in weeding through the research that I've done with actually taking blood samples from players who are actively cramping, and in most cases it's the systemic, full body cramping. I did a series of studies at training camps, taking blood when they're cramping and then looking at them, after they've gotten IV. So I do have a series of a couple of years of data collection of that. And one of the things that you see, and I can just say this up front, is I think, and I've seen it now in the new data we're collecting in the lab, is this electrolyte imbalance. And I think most people think it is the sodium that's the problem. And my research would really point to hypochloremia. It's the chloride that's the problem. So anytime you are in a fluid imbalance situation or a hyponatremia situation, when blood sodium drops, blood chloride is also going to drop. But interestingly, when you look at players who are actively cramping and you look at blood samples from them, everything is normal. Blood sodium is normal, hematocrit hemoglobin, pretty normal. They don't lose any more weight when they cramp versus when they don't cramp. So they're all, 2%, 2.5%, body weight loss, which is very common and normal. Blood potassium tends to run a little bit high, particularly in football players, but that's pretty explainable as well. Because of the physical nature of the sport. So they're little, they can run a little bit high in potassium. But the thing that typically is the case is that their blood chloride is too low. So chloride should range from about 100 to 108 millimoles per liter. And when you take blood from players who are cramping, it's typically at 100 or below. We've had guys as low as 92, 93. What happens is, and then if you look at the same players, which we've done this, right? So we take players when they're cramping and then look at everything we can look at. I look at body weight loss. I look at urine parameters. I look at as much stuff as I can, blood parameter-wise. I've looked at lactate. I've looked at, all the electrolytes I can. If you look at them when they cramp and when they don't cramp, the same players after a practice when they don't cramp, the only thing that's different is chloride. That when they cramp, they have low blood chloride. When they don't cramp, they don't. But when you give them an IV, so this goes to your question right now, when you give a cramping player 2 liters of full saline, what happens is hematocrit and hemoglobin go down a little bit, certainly because you are putting this fluid right into the vasculature. So that's typical, and you would expect that in anybody. Sodium stays about the same. Potassium comes down a little bit within normal range. Typically, it may be like 5. Which is the upper limit of blood potassium when they're cramping, that it'll come down into the 4s. But what you drastically see is blood chloride shoots up. It goes from, maybe an average of 98, 99, and then it'll go up to 104, 105. So chloride is what really changes in all of the blood parameters after you give somebody an IV. And I think that, and part of the reason for that is when you give full saline, so full saline has a sodium concentration of 154 milliequivalents per liter. blood sodium ranges between 135 and 145. So you're giving them about the high level, the same amount of sodium, right? When you give an IV, when you give IV full saline. Chloride in full saline is just like sodium. It's 154 milliequivalent. So you're really dumping in a lot more chloride into the vasculature, when you compare it to what blood chloride typically is, which is about 100 to 108. So you really do put a lot more in, and it chews up, which might be, part of the reason. I think part of the reason for the alleviation of cramping.
Okay, and I hope everyone that's watching along sees this. I'm actively taking notes too, so I think it's. I can see Jeremy furiously writing away as well. So I think that's a good strategy for anyone listening along. I think I want to explore chloride a little bit because I think you've been in the profession a while. Everybody, like, they only pay attention to sodium and ignore everything else, like,
right,
practically speaking.
Right.
But so what role, like, we can go down that physiological rabbit hole a little bit. Does chloride play in, I guess, muscle physiology? So why do you think that, I guess, just to kind of take everybody through back kind of to Anatomy 101, where does chloride kind of really enter the picture for us?
Right. So going back to your muscle physiology, your neuromuscular physiology, if you think about the resting membrane potential of an alpha motor neuron, and you look at how we typically say it's the sodium outside of the cell, it's the potassium inside the cell, and that's what keeps resting membrane potential at negative 70 millivolts. And we know that threshold for an action potential is negative 55 millivolts. So you have to get to that point where the voltage dependent channels open, right? So once the voltage dependent channels open at negative 55 millivolts, then you're going to have muscle contraction, then you're going to have the action potential, and you're going to have all of the muscle fibers that are innervated by that alpha motor neuron are going to contract. So what I explain to my students is that sodium, potassium work really hard to keep resting membrane potential at negative 70. If you throw chloride into the mix, and most people don't think about the chloride, right? Because it's a passive ion, it goes with sodium, and it's kind of like the forgotten. There's actually a good paper out there that talks about chloride, and it's called the forgotten ion. But if you look at chloride, and I always say, if you look at the Nernst equation, and that gets into real muscle physiology, but if you allowed chloride to have its way, it would actually make the resting membrane potential more negative, closer to negative 90 millivolts, right? So it's the chloride that really keeps, in my thought process, chloride really makes the alpha motor neuron more difficult to fire. It takes it away from threshold. So if you think about cramping, and a lot of the players will get the twitching, they'll get the pre-cramping kind of feelings. They know, the players that cramp frequently, they can tell you when they're going to cramp. They tell you on the field. They tell me on the field, look, I'm going to go, because they have this twitching feeling. And my thought process takes me to hypochloremia, which causes the alpha motor neurons to be hyperexcitable. They're more, I guess Kevin Miller would say, they come closer to cramp threshold, right? And in my mind, that means there's closer to the negative 55 millivolts, and that's because there's a lack of chloride that's in those cells, and that would explain probably both the local muscle cramps, and it would explain the muscle cramps that are more systemic in nature.
Yeah,
so that's just my own kind of theory, right? Because I've seen this chloride, and the other thing I will tell you is we tend to, as researchers, we tend to look at our own little world, right? We tend to focus on, for us in athletic training, it's our little athletic training world. And we read journals that are related to our world, right? We read JAT, we read the ACSM journal, MedSci, right? We might read the Journal of Physiology. We read the orthopedic, journals. But we typically don't read outside of that. So I always say, if you're looking at exertional heat stroke, you need to read the anesthesiology journals, because they're the ones that talk about malignant hyperthermia, which is very close to, right?
Yeah.
So you read that world. But where I'm going is, if you do a Medline search, a good Medline search of hypochloremia, what will come up is a whole lot of veterinary journals. Because in the horse world and the equine world, when you're looking at high level athletes, horse athletes, right? The cross country athletes, the hunters, the race horses, right? they also get cramping, and they get systemic cramping. And you have to, I look at a lot of comparative physiology. I like horses to begin with, but anyway, look at horses because their thermoregulation is exactly like humans. Horses thermoregulate like humans do. They sweat in order to dissipate heat, whereas the feline and canine world don't, right? They dissipate heat through panting. So horse physiology is very close to human physiology when it comes to thermoregulation. And I go to that world too, because when I'm studying very large football players, I always think a very large football player, when you look at body mass, you look at body surface area to body mass ratio, they're actually somewhat more like horses than they are like small people, right? Small humans. So anyway, so I read it, but you will find that. And in the horse world, they don't call it, they call it tying up. But horses get in tetanic muscle cramps. And the way they get rid of those is actually to give the horses IV fluids, right?
Yeah.
So, and it also brings their chloride up. So there's a link there. You know, it's not by chance that two different species who thermoregulate the same way have the same issues, right? And you see that hypochloremia in the horse world as well.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I think sometimes I think why people are dismissive of research. And we talked with Kevin a little bit about this last week about the oral nerves that might give some insight into why the relief happens so quickly with some acetic acid. Well, those are rat studies. Those are not done in human studies. And I think that's the same thing with this.
Right.
We have equine studies that might, now we know where to look. And like you said, some players that sometimes resemble the size of horses.
I have a picture. I use a slide I use frequently. People have seen my talks. I have a slide of a horse that's rearing up, right? This black horse that's rearing up, and then a football player that's standing up. And I'm like, they're kind of the same. Like they look the same, right? Versus something that's smaller.
Not too far off. So with I guess kind of like with that in mind, so it always comes down to obviously interventions, right? So we're talking about IVs and things of that nature. We know for many different reasons. I mean, I'm trained to do it. A number of people are trained to do it, but there's just not a lot of us running around, even though I know it's becoming part of our practice. So that leaves your average person that might not be able to do this, or in high school, even if you are trained, you can't set an IV on a minor necessarily.
Right.
So looking into I guess practical ways to approach this. So this is where I was kind of looking at the whole sweat science side of things.
Right.
Because this is a process that I think it's part of our education. We go through it and like the thermoregulation part. And I'm biased. I'm fully biased in this field, but I don't think enough people spend enough time really understanding how beneficial it is to, maybe we can't measure their sweat sodium concentration, right? But we can measure their fluid losses and at least make educated guesses based off of really a sweat patch, how much they drink in pre and post weight. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the more practical intervention side of things? I think that an AT might be able to approach with this.
Right. And I think that's where we're going when you talk about sweat testing. I think that's, it's becoming more and more common. I get this question all the time. So it's very easy for any athlete to calculate their sweat rate, right? You do it in kilograms. So 1 kilogram equals 1 liter. So you weigh yourself. I always tell people, if you want to do a good sweat rate analysis, right? You empty your bladder. You weigh yourself in minimal clothing or nude. We do that, in research. Everybody goes into a specific area and weighs nude. We get a nude body weight. But you weigh yourself in minimal clothing. You go out and exercise in whatever you typically do. So if you're a football player, you need to do football related things. If you're an ice hockey player, preferably you're on the ice, right? So when we test the Flyers, we go to their training center. That's where we test them on the ice during practice, during typically a high intensity practice. So you do what you typically do, right? If you're a soccer player, go play soccer for an hour and do it at fairly high intensity. And I tell people, and I know I get pushback for that, don't drink anything. You will not die if you don't drink for an hour. If you start the exercise bout and you are not thirsty, you're in a normal state of hydration, which means a blood osmolality somewhere probably 285, which means you can lose a couple percent body weight and still be okay. Nothing's going to happen to you, and performance is not going to be affected either. So don't drink anything for an hour. Come back in, towel off, empty your bladder. Hopefully there's not very much urine in the bladder. If you don't drink, then you're probably not producing very much urine, because that's one of the error factors you're going to have, right? Because you in the research world would subtract out that urine. So don't drink anything. Hopefully there's not very much in your bladder. You weigh yourself out, and then you take that difference in body weight in kilograms, and that's how many liters you've lost in an hour. It's really pretty simple, right? You weigh yourself before, you weigh yourself after, dried off in the same clothing. You don't drink anything, and that's what your sweat rate is for that hour. So if you've lost a kilogram, your sweat rate which is 2.2 pounds, which is not very much in an hour, right? So if you exercise for an hour, you lose 2.2 pounds. That's 1 kilogram. That would be 1 liter of or 1 liter of sweat that you've lost. So that's pretty easy to do. And even in a team, it's not difficult. If they are actually practicing for a couple hours, certainly they would have access to fluids, to water. So we would then calculate the fluid, right? So how much fluid do they drink in that 2-hour time period? And you have to add that back in. So it's not hard. It's really not hard to do. The sweat sodium or sweat electrolyte, because I'm just as interested in my field right now in the sweat chloride as I am the sweat sodium. So, those in that situation, if we think that someone has a high electrolyte concentration in their sweat, it really probably is best to measure that, right? So even if you have a whole team that you don't want to measure of 90 players or 60 players or 30 players on a hockey team, if you've got that handful of players that you're worried about that either have difficulty keeping body weight on, when they're playing or practicing in consecutive days, or they're having cramping issues, it might just be worth it for you to do a sweat analysis of the sweat itself, where you collect the sweat and you send it to a lab and you get it analyzed.
Yeah, and I think that's something and just to let everyone know, I do this myself here at Northeastern, and the way I personally think sweat testing, like with what you're looking at from an athlete from a performance and health standpoint, is the cost is very, I think, negligible compared to the benefit you're getting. Like you can talk to any athlete that has suffered from cramps their entire life. And then if you correct a number of things, so getting back to kind of like what Dr. Miller talked about last week, it's not one factor. Right. This is one of many factors, but if we correct this one and it helps the overall picture,
exactly,
you're a healer.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's a miserable experience. So if no matter what, every game it happens, it kills your performance. You're off your whatever sport you're doing, and
absolutely.
You can't.
You are God. I can tell you, some of my biggest fans that I've treated in the NFL are people that have cramped their whole life, and I still in contact with some of those players, and they will tell you, oh my God, you fixed my problem. I've had these issues for 10 years since I started playing, when I was 10 years old. And then you do the analysis, you kind of figure out, and you're right, it may not be one factor, but you figure that out, and let me tell you, your coaches will love you, the players will love you, and you know from personal experience what that's like.
Yes, and I don't even use fancy equipment. I used on my kitchen scale at home. So if I'm weighing water bottles, I bring it home and I mark it off. And our guys.
It's not hard to do, right, Mike? You've done it for years, right?
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet. It's inch square of gauze and Tegaderm.
Exactly. And I'll tell you, the other thing is, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that sweat rate varies, individually, right? So any even male will range from, as little as maybe a half a liter an hour, so 500 milliliters an hour, upwards of, the large football players that I test, 3 liters an hour. So that's a big difference, right? Yeah. 500 milliliters to 3,000 liters. But that sweat electrolytes, if you talk about sweat sodium, the average is about 40 or 50, about 50 millimoles per liter, and that depends on whether or not the athlete is acclimatized. But that range is between about 10 and 100. Okay, I have even outliers from that. But I've tested literally thousands of sweat samples in my lab now, thousands of them. And it ranges between 10 to 100. So that's a 10-fold difference in sweat sodium and chloride as well. So sweat sodium is high, sweat chloride is high as well. Potassium is physiologic. It stays about the same.
Yeah. Would you feel just based off what you've seen, so obviously, just so everybody knows, I don't annually test all 35 of our hockey players. We're not in a position to do that.
Right.
We actually use weight tracking trends to maybe flag some of these people, because I know there's a fluid balance issue.
Right.
And using just averages, I can make a pretty good intervention.
Right.
People who can't do that, do you think it's still worthwhile to, I know N=1, we're all a little bit different, but an athlete who's even having an issue, if we just stick with what an average sweat sodium could be for that person, at least fashioning an intervention from at least that as a starting point.
Right.
Do you think there's still use in that?
I do. And you can tell the people that are really salty sweaters, and I tell athletic trainers this, let those players, after they practice, let their t-shirts dry and see whether or not, if you shake it, and it's just, it's a silly thing, but it's really practical, right? If they have rings around their t-shirts, or if they have salt on their clothing, or they let it dry on their skin and you can brush their arms and the salt comes off, they are salty sweaters, right? Yeah. They have a sweat sodium and sweat chloride concentration that's up in that upper range. So you could even say, well, if the highest range is 100, maybe they're 70 or 80, and you could still do the calculations based on that. So if you take their sweat rate, you still need to measure their sweat rate. If you take their sweat rate and then their, what you estimate their sodium concentration is, you can make a pretty good, you'd have a pretty good idea.
Yeah, and that's why I tell people there's always obviously if you're doing research, you want to be as accurate as possible from just math, number one, but also your outlook. But if we're talking clinically relevant interventions, I always tell people, I'm like, you know what? I'm here to tell you it's okay to be 1 or 2% off.
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's okay.
We're going to do all right.
Exactly. You're doing much more than the average person is doing, right? If you go to that length to do those calculations.
And so we do know, and I think this is where I have my own theories are really based off of in comparison, very limited research that I've done to both you and Kevin. And I think my viewpoint is I think everything, and this is just from clinically practicing, I think starts with fatigue. So I take this from the aerobic capacity standpoint. When I expand plasma volume, they're going to fatigue later, change their movement patterns later, and then utilize energy systems differently. And then I think that's why I know it's complicated, because that is not a simple process.
Right.
Plasma volume is not just one variable and we're good.
Right. Right.
Because I can still make their performance better and they're still going to cramp. So I still haven't solved the problem. I've just made my situation better. But I guess where I'm going with that is now we're talking about, some concerns I definitely see. I answer these questions a lot from other athletic trainers, new people to our staff, other schools of, well, okay, this gets back to kind of the old. So we're basically finding out that people don't eat chloride as chloride. It's usually sodium chloride and that. So it's salt. So we also have FDA recommendations saying these level of salts. I wrote a blog on the BOC blog about this that I got a significant amount of negative feedback. A bit both, and I'm just saying, hey, here's what the FDA says, but here's what sweat science tells me people lose. So if I don't replace this, I'm not in homeostasis. So I guess just for the people listening along, I guess we're about, Jeremy, has anyone had any questions yet?
No, there's lots of people watching live, but nobody's typed in questions yet. So if you have those questions, go ahead and type them in there. We can get those.
Cool, because we just went through a huge fast part about physiology, so I wanted to wait, because they need to raise their hand and ask a question. So, but I guess looking at, alleviating some of the concerns, because I think we're getting away from, if you ingest sodium, you're going to get heat stroke. I think I don't see that as much anymore. I saw that early in my career where it's kind of funny that in the 50s, the bucket of salt tablets was actually probably not that bad of an idea. And it went away because they're like, everyone's going to die. Right. Everyone's going to die. And it's
that was they were withholding water, right? So if you don't drink and you eat salt, right, you're going to have problems too. So if you drink when you want to drink and it's available, you're going to be probably fine. Yeah.
So we know that from the heat stroke standpoint, but I think now we get into the other side, because I know obviously you were involved with the hyponatremia consensus statement and things like that, where I think this is usually where I have these talks with athletic trainers. I want to say all these interventions have good intention. I don't think anyone's doing anything to hurt anybody. No. We know there was the issues in Georgia where the athletes overdrank and unfortunately passed away. But I think there's also the other side. Well, like Kenny said, if we don't drink, then what happens next? And so I think, can you talk just a little bit about if we're trying to get sodium and chloride and all these things in our body, but maybe over drinking we don't want to promote that. What kind of strategies do you think from a risk standpoint might be in that's viewpoint?
Right. So, certainly, and you were talking about the FDA, and I think one of the difficult things related to cramping is When you go into the store, you can see how much sodium and potassium is in any fluid that you're buying, right? Chloride's not on the label unless the company wants to put it on the label.
Mhm.
So I tell people if there's a lot of chloride has to be attached to something, right? Just like sodium does. So it's either sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, or calcium chloride, basically, are the salts, right?
Mhm.
So if you buy something that has a lot of sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, then you're probably getting a lot of chloride too. I warn people away from potassium in preseason. And once again, most of my research is in either the running population or in kids or in football players and hockey players, right? So football and hockey obviously have a component of physical contact, right?
Mhm.
So, the rhabdomyolysis, a little bit of muscle cell death, particularly in the beginning of preseason, will elevate blood potassium. So I try to say, probably don't need to consume outside of your diet a lot of potassium. So, putting back, and we get back to, putting that back, right? Putting back the sodium and potassium that you think somebody loses. I can tell you from the research we've done in NFL players, they are typically consuming, and these are players who have access to, dining hall food, any, good amount of whatever they want to eat, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack. So at least four times, if not 5 times a day. And they typically are consuming about 6 to 8 grams of sodium. That is pretty much what they consume across the board. And I've looked at what I consider sodium turnover studies. So how much sodium do they consume in a day? And on the same day, we do sweat testing, analysis. So we know what they lose, we know what they consume. And what you find is that you have like overconsumers and underconsumers. So everybody's pretty much taking in between 6 and 8 grams of sodium, which is a lot more than what the FDA said, right? A lot more than what we should be taking in. But these are athletes who need to eat functionally. But what you find is some players only lose 3 or 4 grams of sodium and they're eating 6 to 8. But then you have the other players that are losing 8, 10, 12 grams of sodium and they're only consuming 6 to 8. So it's those players that you really need to focus on, right?
Mhm.
If you're consuming too much sodium and you have normal kidneys and you're drinking, appropriate fluids with that, you're going to just get rid of that extra sodium.
Mhm.
It's the players that day after day. It's not going to be a problem, I don't think, in one day of practice, or it's not going to be a problem in somebody running for a couple hours on one day. It's going to be a problem if they're consecutive days, and that's where the sodium kind of depletion comes in, right? Where you're practicing in the heat on consecutive days. We don't have the multiple practices in football anymore, so we don't see that problem as much now as we used to. But it's those players that need to replace that sodium. And body weight's a good. So when I'm talking to clinicians, body weight is a really good way to track that, right? So if you are tracking morning body weight, on consecutive days during preseason, and players are not regaining their body weight, that is probably a sodium depletion problem. They are the people that you really need to focus on getting more sodium and chloride into their diet. If they are maintaining body weight, it's probably not a problem. And then the fluid, as far as fluid goes, and you're talking to a drink to thirst person, right? So your thirst mechanism is absolutely appropriate for maintaining fluid and electrolyte balance. If you are consuming more salt in your diet, you will be thirstier because it is going to make osmolality higher, blood osmolality higher, and it's going to stimulate your thirst mechanism. So one of the things that we have to really start to dispel, we haven't gotten into this hyponatremia research and this over drinking research, which we just finished an 18-month data collection in our lab looking at that specific thing. But if you teach people to listen to their thirst mechanism, they're going to be fine. We have to dispel this myth that body weight loss or dehydration is really harmful, because it's not, and you're actually safer if you lose body weight during an exercise bout than if you gain it, right? So if you're gaining weight, you are at very big risk of EAH. If you lose weight, and you really should lose weight, even maintaining weight is a risk factor for EAH. If you start, I always tell people, if your athletes start practice not thirsty, and you allow them free access to water, they are never going to be in a situation where they lose enough body weight to either affect health and welfare or affect performance, right? Because they are going to keep themselves in that 2 to 2.5% body weight loss. And all of the research shows that that's not going to be a problem. Are there studies here and there that might kind of, I don't know, point to that, but I know that that's a big thing, right? So now it's not that dehydration is going to kill you. It's the dehydration that is going to cause you to not play as well. And that really is not true either. If you allow your athletes free access to water, right?
Yeah.
And they have some idea of listening to their thirst mechanism, they're going to be fine. Most of them are still going to overdrink because they drink ad lib.
Yeah.
They drink when they want to, not when they're really thirsty.
One of my favorite studies of yours, I know you've done a lot, so I'm sure you have your own, is the one that demonstrated the lack of differences between pro football players and D2 football players in college.
Yeah.
I think this is where, like you said, you've got pro football players literally being chased around practice facilities with people holding trays of whatever their hydration sponsor is.
Exactly.
And you've got the polar opposite, which is 3 fields and a central water station that's just all water.
Yeah.
Everything's the same. Their replacement rates, everything, nothing changes. So I think, Jeremy, I know you've seen this in some of the secondaries. I know this is a topic of fighting among secondary APs in jest. Well, this school's got all these resources for practice. This school doesn't. They smoke us every single year. I'm like, guys, if you have a jug to put water in, you can't really complain about that. Like that's not a hydration problem. That might be a football problem.
That is actually a really good clinical study, and it was all done on the field. It was all field research. But you're right.
That's why I like it so much. It's like you can't argue. This happened at practice. Vastly different skill levels in a sport, and I was like, and all their physiological characteristics were pretty close.
Exactly the same. Yeah, you're right. I forgot about you. Read about things that you published that are like, oh my God, and other people like, you remember when you did this study? Yes, that was just a really awesome study, and I was not surprised. I guess I was a little surprised at how similar they were. Like one group lost 2%, and the other group lost 2.2%. It was exactly the same. All the parameters were the same, and the hydration protocol was totally different, like you said.
And I know
every player had like a hydration person with them, and the other was pumpers on the field.
And I know you can see big differences and stuff like that with completely untrained populations compared to an athlete.
Right.
But when they're both fairly athletic, I think with standard deviations, and I think that's sometimes where, especially in blood plasma variables, like you're talking like potassium doesn't move. I think some of the criticism of the research is, oh, well, they didn't have 1,000 people. I'm like, that's homeostasis. That doesn't change, but sweat rate is on the other side where, well, you do need 1,000 people because it varies widely. And so absolutely. I think that gets into how people actually appraise literature, usually poorly, I think, compared to current interventions. But that's just a personal soapbox of mine. But one of the things I think you mentioned really quickly that I wasn't going to let you get away without talking about this, because I see it all the time and it drives me nuts, this adherence to replacement drinks. I mean, Pedialyte's just a brand. Like I use the generic version for my kid when he's sick. I don't use Pedialyte because it's more expensive than the other one.
Right, exactly.
They all do the same thing. But I think it was the information you found out about potassium that I remember like one of our talks, I don't think you actually either expected or were even looking for necessarily, but you noticed some pretty dangerously high levels of potassium in these high contact athletes. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Right. So, the research that I've done in the professional and college as well, the nice thing about my situation is that I can see what I see at the pro level and study certain things. And then when I really think is interesting, I have more control over my college guys. So I can actually have them do things that I, couldn't have the NFL guys do. But we did a series of studies over, 8 or 9 years of sodium and actually sodium in particular, because I didn't know about the chloride at this time, but sodium replacement drinks, different things that we could do to try to put the sodium back after we realized the amount that they were losing based on their sweat losses. So we started with Rehydralite and Pedialyte. So we did that study one year where we actually gave them a specific amount of Rehydralite and Pedialyte. And we did see really high, I'm trying to think that year. I don't know whether I didn't look at potassium or wasn't paying that attention to that. But anyway, the next year, because I had a lot of high school people say, well, we can't afford, $10,000 of buying Pedialyte or Rehydralite for our whole football team. What do we do? So then the pickle juice came in, right? So I did a study looking at, and this was in the NFL, the pickle juice, a group doing pickle juice and a group doing Rehydralite and Pedialyte. And I matched the players. I had them drink exactly the same sodium intake. throughout a day, and we did it over the course of 6 or 8 days. And we did see, as you mentioned, on day 3, both of those groups of the pickle juice and the Rehydrolate group had average potassiums above 5. So that was a little alarming because we were seeing very high potassium. The sodium was really great. The chloride was great. Their body weight was great. Everything looked, really very good, except the potassium. So that was worrisome. And what I wasn't taking into consideration is that both, while Rehydrolite, Pedialyte, and pickle juice all have a high amount of potassium in it. So I was worried about that.
Yeah, because I think what you shared with me was it wasn't necessarily the post-ingestion period that was worrisome. It was their baseline measurement for the day. They've done nothing. The next morning, the next day, I think you even said you had a subject or two that was up 5.5, 5.6, and I'm like, and I guess we're talking numbers here. I need to remember our audience. Just revisit like with hyperkalemia really quick. Like when does it become problematic?
Hypochloremia?
Sorry. High potassium for hyperkalemia.
Yeah. So normal, and our body is very careful at regulating this, right? So blood potassium should range between about 3.5 to 5. Some labs say 5.2. So about 3.5 to 5. And some, our players, the mean, so the average of both the pickle juice and the Rehydrolate juice was like 5.2. So that means, they did range from like 4.5 to 5.5 or even 5.6, I think we had. And that was, as you said, the important thing there was we were taking those blood samples first thing in the morning. So they were coming down to the lab area and provided a blood sample before the morning practice. So this was not, after 2 practices in the day. So that was the baseline. Like you said, that was their baseline blood potassium.
Yeah.
So when we stopped doing that, so then that really led to the idea of, okay, we know we need to put the sodium and chloride back. And I wasn't sure at that point how the chloride played a role, but we know that we need to put that sodium back, but let's do it without potassium. And I literally, for several years, made drinks. I got off the shelf drinks that were kind of fruit based and it actually works better if they're kind of citrus based because it masks the salt a little bit. And I was literally putting salt into drinks without any potassium. So there may have been a little potassium in the drinks, but I was making, sodium chloride drinks, right? And then I made the same for everybody until I really started to see a huge difference in the sodium concentration of sweat. And then I started making individual drinks for players. So I literally had, 15 players and I had their names on the top of these drinks. And I was, putting 5 grams into one drink or 2.5 grams into one drink and 5 grams into another drink. And that's how kind of the individual supplementation ended up occurring over the course of, several years.
And I guess for those listening along, I just want to be clear, do not buy pure sodium and throw it in water. This is all with, you can watch YouTube on why that's a bad idea, but sodium chloride, salts, table salts, which you can get at Costco, not pure sodium. You'll have a pretty bad time if you throw pure sodium into water. So just please refrain from doing that.
And I'm going to go farther. Yeah, and you're right. You're absolutely right, Mike. And the other thing you have to understand is if you are putting a lot of sodium in a drink, you need to put a lot of carbohydrate, particularly glucose or dextrose, in the drink as well, because not only will it not be absorbed, the sodium and chloride won't be absorbed, it won't be retained in the body. So if you're not putting some carbohydrate into that drink or having them drink the salty drink with a meal, then most of that, and we've done those studies in the lab, about 60% of what you're putting in, if you don't combine it with carbohydrate, 60% of the sodium you put in, if it's not combined with carbohydrate, is going to end up in the toilet within 3 hours after you do that.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to replace it, you have to do it with carbohydrate.
And typically when we use the right stuff, that's exactly what we do is I don't you'll get athletes that'll they'll take that and just, it's gross. They'll just eat the packet and run off, which I don't know how people do that. That's a lot of sodium. It probably tastes okay, but I don't do that. But
they have like sucralose in theirs, right? So to make it taste a little sweeter. But if you really want it to be retained, it's got to be, like you said, with something.
Yeah, we always have it do it with team meals and things like that, which is something that I think it's a good option, I think, because we always talk about, I think is the information you shared with me that it's increasingly being found that dextrose, of all the sugars we hate from a health standpoint, the most refined processed sugar helps with sodium retention. Why is that?
Because you have it's all about really absorption, right? So you have a passive sodium and glucose transporter out of the intestines. So in order to really absorb that sodium and not have it go right through the intestinal system, you need to have the carbohydrate, and particularly glucose. It's a glucose transporter. So anything that breaks down quickly into glucose is going to be helpful. So you can use sucrose, which is table sugar, or you can use fructose, but they have to be converted into dextrose. Most drinks don't use dextrose for I think 2 reasons. One, it's not as sweet as sucrose or fructose, and 2, it's considerably more expensive. So if you see a drink that has dextrose in it or multidextrin, it's probably more expensive than something that has like fructose in it, right? Or high fructose corn syrup, right? Is the really bad one we all talk about. And people use that because it's cheap, right? And it's sweet. But it's also not very good for you. So you need the glucose and the sucrose. And that's the research back in the 60s, right? When sport drinks came of age, was really about that. It was about fluid uptake and how fluid was absorbed in the intestines, quicker or better if you had sodium and glucose combined, right? And that was all about fluid replacement. But there's a difference in fluid replacement and sodium replacement, because if you look at the typical sport drink, it has about 6 to 7% carbohydrate, but it only has 18 to 20 milliequivalents of sodium, right? So go back to what I said about the average sweat sodium is between 40 and 60. It's right about 50, 52, right? Which is 2.5 times what's in the typical fluid replacement drink. If you're trying to replace sodium, and my feeling is chloride with that sodium, if you're trying to replace sodium, then the sodium content has to be considerably higher than that. So, in talking with people like Ron Mon, who did a lot of research over in Europe with the soccer players, he and I were on the same writing group for the consensus paper. So I talked a lot to Ron because he'd done this kind of research too. And he also was making drinks, by the way, for their Olympic soccer team, right, in the UK. So we're not talking about somebody who doesn't know what he's doing, right? But he was making drinks that were 60 to 70 milliequivalents of sodium. So 3 times what's in a typical fluid replacement drink. So sodium replacement drinks really need to be high in sodium, but they also need to be high in carbohydrate. And there was a really good study that came out of Japan about 5 or 6 years ago. And they found that the optimal carbohydrate concentration in a sodium replacement fluid is 10 to 12%. So if you're really trying to replace the sodium and chloride, you also need to have that amount of carbohydrate. And typically you're drinking that drink after practice, by the way. You're not drinking it during practice. Now, I will tell you, triathletes and people like that are drinking it along the way, right?
Yeah.
They're drinking fluids that are high in carbs because they need the carbs. But those are sodium replacement drinks, not fluid replacement drinks that you drink during practice. And I think it's very convoluted. People don't understand the difference between the two.
Yeah, and I think that's where some of the issues come about. I think looking at that, I think we always run into this. I'm sure you've had discussions with this, especially in the NFL and probably college as well, is I think beverage temperature, because everyone wants to know if I drink it body temperature, does it leave my stomach faster? Does it diffuse across the small intestine? What are your thoughts on
I think it needs to be palatable. I mean, I think some of the old research showed, and I know what Kevin has done a lot more research in the gastric studies, certainly much more than I have it. And but my feeling is it needs to be palatable. And there are some people who don't like real cold fluids. So if they don't like real cold fluids, they're less likely to drink it even when they're thirsty. So I personally drink things that are more room temperature because I tolerate it better. So as far as the gastric emptying and uptake, I don't think it really matters because by the time it gets to the intestines, it's body temperature anyway, right? Yeah. So whether or not it empties from the stomach a little faster if it's colder, I don't know. I would have to ask Kevin about that because I haven't done those studies.
Yeah, and I think I'm more of the practical opinion side of things is kind of what you said. It's like we can have all the science in the world, but it doesn't matter if it's still in the container.
Exactly.
It can taste great, but if they don't drink it, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. I will say that most people, and being on the football field a lot during preseason, Most of the players, when it's hot, they like something cold because it feels better to them, right? So if it makes them feel better, does it cool them down? Probably not. They would have to drink so much of it, it would make them hyponatremic if they drank that much. But it feels better for them. So certainly providing them with what they like you said, from a practical standpoint, is best.
Or like when we had a hockey game, we played one of the games that they had at the ice rink in Fenway Park. And I remember at that game, I had to put lukewarm water in the water bottle so they wouldn't freeze by the end of the first period. So
there you go.
I found that out the hard way.
It's all about the practical part, right?
Yeah. I was like, you can either have water or not have water. And we'll talk about temperature later because it's going to freeze. So,
exactly.
Yeah, it was 30 degrees at game time. It was pretty early. So, so I guess along those lines, when we talk about ingestion of chlorine or chloride, not chlorine, don't drink chlorine. So if chloride is really kind of what we're getting at here, so I have at least information on how long it takes for sodium to be, after you ingest it, how long it's actually utilized, not just circulated in the bloodstream, but time to utilization. Have you noticed anything with chloride with that? Any research with that, or?
I haven't. Most people are not studying chloride that way, right? So I think that's an area that would be really great to have people study more from a cellular level. My guess is it's similar to it's got to be similar to sodium, because it's a passive ion and it goes with sodium. So any place sodium's going, chloride is going as well. Yeah. So I would think that would be true all the way along the line, like you were talking about.
Yeah, because that's the thing is we all see it. It's just someone's having an acute cramping bout, and it's like, guys, anything they're eating or drinking right there is not leaving their stomach. It will at some point and be beneficial, but probably it's not going to be ready in the point. I think that was where Kevin and I only got so far in the other podcast about, okay, well, let's explore this neurological topic, which I think if we're dealing with chloride, and again, ion channels, I mean, that is neurological in my opinion. So, or it's not my opinion, I think that's scientific opinion. So do you think, where does this fit in like the neurological side of things, do you think?
And once again, this is not my area of research, but certainly there are receptors in the back of the throat that are like osmoreceptors. And I do think absolutely there are some things that you can consume that will, maybe relax muscle cramping immediately or within a reasonable time period that are affected by those receptors. So acetic acid, I think, is one, and that's why things like mustard and things like pickle juice and vinegar, those types of things work because of the acetic acid. Yeah, and I do think that plays a role as well. I mean, we've talked about the fact that cramping is multifactorial.
Okay, so I think Jeremy, how much time are we looking at here? I've got selfishly lots of questions I can answer, but I want to make sure I'm being conscious of time constraints.
Right.
It's really kind of depends on Sandy if she has I know Mike, you have a stop time, and so we'll kind of keep going until one of you just ends the call. Okay. But Tim Ackland, he's watching live. I know Perry just asked that, or Mike just asked Perry's question, but he said, "What do you think about pretzels and fluids pregame as far as?" We're talking about cramping science. And I know last week when we talked to Kevin Miller, Mike, you mentioned that the fluid replacement has to start before game. And, again, here you mentioned that each individual situation, each individual cramp is that exactly that. It's one cramp, it's one player, and there's so many other factors. But in general, thoughts on pretzels or salty foods and fluids pregame?
Yeah, I'm a real fan of putting the salt back in the diet, right? So making sure that it's all about preventing. In my feeling is if you can prevent the cramps from happening, obviously that's what you want to do. And putting the sodium and chloride or back in and the carbohydrates back in that food at meals is always the best way to go. So anything you can do like that, I think is going to be very helpful. So yeah, pretzels are absolutely a good alternative as far as putting the salt back with carbohydrate, right?
Yeah, and I would say with the nutrient timing thing, because that's an area where my just personal investigation's gone to answer, I think further is, I think when the bus gets to the field right before a game is probably too late. You need to encourage these athletes to either have it with breakfast or lunch. Because if, again, to what Dr. Fowkes-Godek has noticed with chloride being, there might be something there to this. If it does follow sodium, then let's pay attention to the sodium. And I know if our personal experience with that is people that have been salty sweaters that we've identified with sweat testing, they're only in a good place if they're doing it at like a 1 o'clock lunch with a 7 o'clock game.
Right.
And so, but I also think there's the other benefit, and we kind of talked about this a little bit with Kevin, and this is a whole other podcast because it's totally different about hydration. If
Right.
you're on that road, is a plasma volume expansion. Right. So you're going to get what's largely a performance benefit too. Like if they have an expanded plasma volume before an aerobic activity where an aerobic energy system is used, yeah, you're going to delay fatigue, ignoring all other aspects about sports. So I would say, I know athletic training is primarily healthcare, but when we work with sport, you can't ignore the performance side of things.
Right.
We all know fatigued athletes get hurt more. Like I
Exactly.
think the epidemiology supports that. But so yeah, why wouldn't you want to give your athletes expanded plasma volume, greater aerobic capacity, and potentially offset or delay, hopefully prevent the potential or the situation that contributes to cramping.
Right. Hey, Mike and Jeremy, I do have to cut it off. I've got to go. And if maybe we can, do another one, if there's other questions that come in. I didn't talk at all about the research that I have gone on in my lab, which is really awesome research as far as fluid replacement goes. But I got to jump. I got to run.
That works. Yeah, and I think, in all honesty, I think if we're going to talk fluid replacement, I would argue that's a totally different topic in general.
Right.
Like, totally different topic.
Exactly.
We're not even talking about cramping. We're talking about, and I think that's probably value as just a podcast in its own.
Okay.
Not trying to take over Jeremy's. He's running this, but
No, I love it. Because the more we can dig into this and help me understand, because I'm not a researcher, the more you guys talk and I can just pick up little pieces here, ask my questions, ask the people's questions, then it just helps us to grow. So Sandy, if somebody wants to get a hold of you or find some of your research, where's the best way to do that?
Probably my Westchester email. So sfowkes.godek@wcupa.edu. So you should be able to find me on the Westchester website in the Department of Sports Medicine.
All right, or if you just Google Sandra Fowkes, it's going to come up as either her on Loveland or her at the Westchester or the Heat Institute. Any of those things there, if you just Google search, because I did that like 6 times in the last 2 days, you're going to find her. Right.
Okay.
So if for some reason you can't remember that email address or you can't remember sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/cramping science folks, you can also just Google her and you'll be able to find all her contact information there. All right. So Dr. Fowkes, if you want to just go ahead and hit your little red button, you can jump out of the call and then I'll finish closing it out with Mike. So.
All right. Perfect. Thanks guys so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate
Wonderful.
it.
Thank you.
Very informative. Thank you.
All right, Mike. So as she's closing it out, any other thoughts, any things you want to share before we wrap it up completely?
I think it's I always like talking with Sandy and Kevin together because I think with both of their areas of research, you get a much, and I mean, like you said, you're in this learning process with this too. So I think you can probably echo. You get a very broad spectrum of information, and the joys of research have probably caused more questions than it actually answered. And I'm sorry to anybody listening for that if that's the case. But it's the truth. Like Kevin alluded to, it's a really complicated issue. It's not as simple as throw a mustard packet at someone and you're golden. Like, yeah, that might have worked for one athlete 3 years ago, but you might have an entirely different problem. Maybe it's fatigue. Maybe it's this new exciting research into chloride that has some pretty serious implications for hydration, which we were talking about with IVs. I didn't go down the IV ban, rabbit hole too much because we just know that's not feasible in very, very, very many settings. So it's, what's practical for you, I think is, it is complicated, but everything we did, like assessing this outside of sweat testing is largely free. It just takes, AT power to really do. So it's like whether you get student aids, you can gather a lot of this information. And heck, athletes can report it back to you on their own, like looking at sweat rates and things of that nature. And again, being able to estimate free, it's an equation, it's math. You can make a macro in an Excel sheet to do it for you. I think that's pretty easy to do. Did you have any questions you want to see if I can answer? Or we still got some time?
No, I mean, we covered some of the questions that were asked live. I know that one of the things that I think it was Trent Trump had mentioned is that instead of looking for these products to prevent cramping, we need to do the education on the front end. And he was saying if you carry these products around, it kind of enables the athletes to to not do the preventative care. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. I think we obviously want people to, like, we're there to help people. And then I think there's a fine balance into people relying on you and not changing their behavior to help themselves. And so I think there's a big discussion to be had there where, yeah, you need to, kind of like what Sandy was saying, the vast majority of things that derail any of what we're talking about is the behavior of the patient, not our behavior necessarily. So we need to train them, educate them in the sense of give them something they can do that's easy. Like, I know you spoke with the Right Stuff people. If you just give them a Right Stuff packet in your lunch and just say, drink water the rest of the day, any athlete can do that. You don't have to be any level of athlete to like achieve that. That's adding something to your lunch. That's it. And so I think things like that are what we need to do. And I think, yeah, it does start with understanding on the AT side of things, like what interventions am I providing my patient? And there is a very, very good evidence-based argument to be made with things like this, because we're dealing with parts of the human body that support homeostasis. So the same arguments that could be made for, well, I did this group of exercises and it prevented an injury and there might not be some research there, but it didn't hurt anyone, is a different discussion when I'm having people overdrink, gain weight during exercise to prevent cramping, but I also might be causing hyponatremia unintentionally. So I think that's a very valid point that I think ATs need to be more aware of.
One of the things you said, is putting the Right Stuff or whatever it is, the pretzels and those fluids in their lunch. Is that something that you do every single day? Or so like soccer, they're not going to practice Wednesday, so they have a game Monday, they have a game Friday, and they're not going to practice Wednesday. So on Wednesdays, do I still need to do that? Or is this only on game days that I need to focus on that? Or what does that look like?
I think it would be not looking at it as and this is where I think sometimes our interventions get distracted by the setting we're in because we're focusing on games. And it's almost like ignore the game, that it's a game. You want to focus these interventions when they're going to have the highest level of physical activity. Because unfortunately, we have athletes we know they don't play on Friday nights, they don't play on Saturdays. So we don't want that intervention for them because it's not useful. It's a waste of their time. But they're all going to go through that hard practice Monday, that hard practice Tuesday, and that's where you might, build on their front end into a week, which is, I think, more specific to certain high school sports, because I know obviously volleyballs and some other sports play every Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so you kind of have to look at that a little bit closer. But I think it's more about whether that intervention is necessary. And we talked a little bit about it, the body weight tracking. So if you have an athlete that is just watching the numbers, and if they start trending down, well, we need to do an intervention. Even if it's a Wednesday, they're not doing anything. Like, they've got to get back up so they're prepared for Thursday's higher bout of exercise, if that makes sense.
All right. So a lot of times in Texas in August, we'll have a morning football practice. So I'll get those kids that don't eat breakfast, or maybe they just have a banana so that they're not puking at practice. So to prevent the dehydration, the cramping, what do you recommend for us to educate those athletes on so that they're ready for the next day, since they can't, have lunch and prepare for the dinner practice? So how do we do that?
I think that's one I think really specific to high school, where I would get the parents involved with your preseason meetings, because what's going to happen is their first thing in the morning practice is going to be influenced most by what they're eating for dinner at home that night. And so if you get the parents involved, I mean, I know kids still cook for themselves, but a lot of the parents, and I'm one now too, feed their kids. And so if you get them involved with this process, knowing that, hey, you're not only doing right by your son or daughter, it's nutritionally beneficial for them the next morning. We don't ever advocate skipping meals, but I'm with you. I know it happens, but it's nutrient timing. It's almost front loading them. So even if they're sleeping overnight, there's still something in the tank the next morning that's supplemented with like a bagel and peanut butter or banana or something like that. Because we deal with that a lot too. We have a lot of morning practices in the collegiate setting, distance running, soccer's, our volleyball team practice at 6 a.m. every day this year. So it's definitely the dinner portion is where you should focus on that.
All right. And then again, our list that we kind of came up with, Dr. Miller, was, like we just said, if you're going to prepare for the highest activity level, you want to start, several hours before. You want to know that there's many factors involved. So you got to ask good questions. Just like he was saying, is it because of stress with the homework or something at the home life, or no sleeping, or a cold, or things like that? So know that those other factors kind of make them more likely to cramp or to be dehydrated, and also they affect their nutrition. Consider keeping a cramp journal for frequent crampers, and then once a cramp happens, you want to stretch that immediately, and then the small amount of pickle juice will help again immediately. But the as athletic trainers, one of the things we are, I guess, trending back towards is the preventative medicine, where so long we've been the reactive medicine. Again, the prevention is so much more valuable. Is there anything else that you think on that list that we kind of need to fine tune or adjust or add?
No, I think it's a pretty good list, because even with the ingestion portion, like we said, Sandy's research with chloride does follow a lot of the sodium replacement. So I think you will get some of that. And I would say the way that list is actually organized in order is perfect. It's got, fatigue, sleep, and stress, these macro type ideas that, if we're being, honest with our athletes, if I'm giving someone on a sideline, that is a micro intervention. There is a lot of things that have gone wrong and snowballed long before that point. And so if we're talking about fatigue, stress, and sleep, you're going to have a global positive effect with your athletes. And that's just me kind of backing up from the topic we're talking to and just advocating that I know we live in a world that's tech heavy, kids don't sleep, and there's a lot of stressors out there, but it all starts with that. And then everything kind of snowballs downhill, because now you're going to find all the other problems of they're not eating because of class. They're not sleeping because of homework. They're not sleeping because of social life and things like that. Well, there's lots of positive benefits to that before you and I start talking about, is this right stuff at lunch or afternoon snack? None of that matters if they slept 3 hours. None of it matters. And then, so I think that's where that order of that hierarchy, kind of like the upside, like the pyramid, I think is a really good place to start.
All right. And then the chloride topic, like, it was kind of a little beyond me from my understanding, or I just kind of got lost in there. And so she was saying a lot of the drinks that you would find at the store, whether that's Hoist or Gatorade powered, whatever, they don't list their chloride unless they specifically decide to, but the chloride has to be attached to something like potassium
Correct.
chloride or sodium chloride. So can you, I guess, just make that a little simpler for me to understand?
Yeah. So it's kind of like, and the reason I told people, it's the same reason, like you can't eat pure chloride and you can't eat pure sodium, because I know people have seen the YouTube videos. If you throw pure sodium in water, it explodes. So that's why you can't eat that. Chloride's no different. There's obviously it doesn't react like that, but dietary wise, you don't want to do that. And so what she's talking about is, obviously our body breaks down nutrients when you ingest it. So since it's bonded to sodium, is sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, you can look for those in the ingredients, usually in the ingredient section. Unfortunately, some will just list it as an ingredient, but they won't necessarily tell you how much is in there. So you're still kind of guessing a little bit, but some's better than none. But I think that's something that it's becoming more prevalent in the cramping research world, because when they look at sweat outputs on their electrolyte analyzers, they've got, sodium, chloride, magnesium, potassium, and all the different electrolytes. And they're starting to notice more and more trends with that chloride number. So trying to find foods and liquids and things that have that in it, I think, is really what we're getting at. And that's why I think the right stuff is something that she said they use pretty frequently, is because when we're talking about calories, intake, diet's important. We want to have some influence there. And that's one of the healthier ways to kind of get that amount of sodium and that amount of chloride, with little to no negative caloric benefit. So some people are like, well, if I just go get a bucket of, 12 piece from KFC, there's plenty of sodium in that. I was like, well, yeah, but there's also a whole lot of other things you don't want to be ingesting from an athletic standpoint. Whereas the right stuff, or a product like that, concentrates it for you, and you can add it as part of maybe a more nutritious meal. Does that help?
Yeah. So Mike is saying the right stuff. It's actually a product called The Right Stuff. And I've been talking with David, and he's looking at sponsoring the podcast. And so if you Google The Right Stuff, and the plan is to have him kind of on here talking about the science about it, but he's not just mentioning go make sure you find the correct stuff at the store, but he's actually saying The Right Stuff is a specific product. So as we're kind of discussing the chloride, what are some other options that we can find, like in food, some things that you recommend that might be beneficial in that area?
In that area, there's a lot of options, so to speak. But But chloride is a little bit of a different animal. I mean, it's going to come in sea salt. You're going to find it in tomatoes, lettuce, celery, olives. So they always hear if you like chloride, enjoy a Mediterranean diet. I hear that pretty frequently. If you like Greek food, you get a lot of chloride and things of that nature. And I like Greek food, so it works. But I think there's a lot of things that, or like when you tell people, if you have a salad, make sure it's colorful. You're probably getting your chloride there too. Now, what we don't know yet, and this is where I think Sandy will be a really good source, is so like Kevin and I talked about how you can lose, no matter how much of any type of average sports drink you can get, you're never putting enough sodium back in your body. I would say chloride's not too far off from that because it's usually paired with sodium. So those levels aren't going to reach what you're losing in sweat. So we probably need a little bit more of those numbers to make a definitive statement, but I would argue it's probably along those lines. And then as far as like what drinks are concerned, like Sandy said, a lot of it's just read the label. And this is what I try to get across to people is the FDA requires labels, they require accurate information. And so a lot of this is based off human physiology, not necessarily the manufacturing process of the product. So depending on what's available to you, if you're a Gatorade school, Powerade school, Body Armor sponsors the NCAA now. So it's like there's a lot of options, I think, available to a lot of ATs, and you'll achieve the same goal. It's not just one product or the other.
All right. I think that is all I have. I don't see any more questions. So there were a whole lot of people that joined watching live. So let me run through those real quick. Alexis Padilla joined watching live. Perry mentioned his question. Tim Akin, Mark Phillips, Jeff Hopp, John Harmon, Shannon Hall, Tanya Watson, Joe Scarcella, all of them joined watching live, and I'm pretty sure there was more that just don't join. And I'm not exactly sure how you do that, but so thanks for watching live. Thanks for asking questions, participating. Mike, thanks for creating more opportunities for podcasts and learning about all the cramping science, the blood plasma, whatever it is you were saying, stuff like that. So
sorry, I probably overcomplicated it way too much.
All right. Well, of course, this is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/cramping science folks, which is FOWKES. Again, cramping science folks. And then, Mike, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's going to be the best way?
Same thing. My work email is my first initial M. last name, McKenney, McKenney at northeastern.edu.
All right. Of course, I'm Jeremy Jackson, host of the Sports Medicine Broadcast. So anywhere you go on the Sports Medicine Broadcast, you can find me. So it's pretty easy there. I've been trying to do a lot of Facebook Live, so I really want you to join there. So if you're checking it out, most Wednesdays during the school year, but I'm also working on creating events that are scheduled. So if you're just on if you're following or liking the Sports Medicine Broadcast on Facebook, then it should send you notifications whenever I have something going live or something like that. So it's a great way to join live, to ask those questions live, to be part of the conversation, and really just kind of learn and share together. So I really appreciate everybody joining in. Some of the partners for the Sports Medicine Broadcast: Frio Hydration, Dragonfly Max, Myotech, Hoist Hydration, and MedBridge. Most of those, if they have a promo code, if you put the SMB in there, then it'll get you some sort of discount. Or if not, then just tell them that Sports Medicine Broadcast or Jeremy Jackson sent you. So again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/cramping science folks. Mike McKenney, Dr. Sandra Fowkes-Godek. Fantastic time learning, and I look forward to lots more. So Mike, thank you, sir. And that is a wrap.